Did you know there's a village in South Africa where women lose their sanity the moment they break their marriage vows? In the land of Nuku, a deeply revered custom curses women with madness if they're unfaithful to their husbands. The only way to restore their sanity is through their husband's forgiveness and a sacred cleansing ritual. No one dares to defy this powerful tradition. But what happens when someone breaks it to save the life of a loved one? If today is your first time on my channel and you enjoy true story like this, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more captivating stories. Hope you've done? Okay, let's continue. This is the heart-wrenching story of Thandi, who risked everything, even her sanity, for the health of her beloved husband. You won't believe what happened next. Thandi and Sipho had been happily married for 5 years. Their love for each other was so strong that their neighbors in the small village of Nuku often said, "Look at Thandi and Sipho. That's what real love looks like." Together, they had a beautiful daughter, Ayanda, the light of their lives. Their small family was filled with joy and laughter, and their home was always warm with love. But one day, their happiness was shattered. Sipho began feeling unusually weak and tired. At first, Thandi thought it was just exhaustion, but his condition worsened. Despite his protests, she urged him to see a doctor. After many tests, they received devastating news. Sipho's kidneys were failing. His health rapidly declined, and Thandi did everything she could to support him. She sold her jewelry, their car, and even a small plot of land. Friends and family pitched in, but it still wasn't enough. 8 months later, the doctor delivered a grim ultimatum. Sipho needed a kidney transplant soon, or he wouldn't survive. The cost of the surgery was 200,000 rand, an amount so large that Thandi felt faint just hearing it. She sat by Sipho's hospital bed, holding his hand as tears streamed down her face. "What will I do? I can't lose him," she whispered. Desperate, Thandi explored every possible way to raise the money. She approached her best friend, Nomad, who introduced her to a wealthy businessman named Mr. Dlamini. He had the financial means to help, but his assistance came with a painful price. He wanted to sleep with Thandi in exchange for the money. One sunny Sunday morning, Thandi stood alone in the hospital hallway. She leaned against the cold wall, her mind racing with thoughts of her husband lying helpless in his hospital bed. Nomad appeared, walking briskly towards her. Her high heels echoed loudly on the tile floor. "Thandi," she said firmly, "are you still thinking about this? There's no time to waste. You have to decide now." Thandi's face was pale, her eyes swollen from hours of crying. "Nomad, you don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "Sipho is from Nuku. You know our tradition. If I sleep with another man, I'll go mad. What will happen to Ayanda if I lose my mind? Who will care for hers?" Nomad sighed deeply and placed a comforting hand on Thandi's shoulder. "I understand, my friend. But think about it. Sipho loves you. He's the only one who can save you by performing the cleansing ritual. Once he recovers, we'll tell him the truth. He'll forgive you. He'll understand that you did it to save his life. You'll all be happy again." Tears flowed down Thandi's cheeks as she shook her head. "But what if he doesn't survive the surgery, Nomad? What will happen to Ayanda? Who will take care of her then? And even if I go through with this, who will look after her until Sipho recovers?" Nomad's voice softened. "Thandi, don't worry about that. I'm your best friend. I'll look after Ayanda. I'll even care for Sipho until he's strong again. I promise you everything will be okay. You love your husband, don't you? Then you have to do this for him. Sleep with Mr. Dlamini, get the money, and save Sipho's life." Thandi's heart broke into a million pieces. The weight of Nomad's words crushed her. How could she even consider such a thing? How could she face herself afterward? Just then the doctor walked by. His white coat billowed slightly as he hurried along the corridor. When he saw Thandi, he stopped. "Mrs. Thandi," he called. "Please see me in my office." Wiping her tears, Thandi followed the doctor, her legs feeling like lead. She stepped into the small office, where the doctor sat behind a cluttered desk. Removing his glasses, he looked at her with concern. "Mrs. Thandi," He began gently. Have you been able to raise the money for Sipho's surgery? Thandi shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. No, doctor. I'm still trying. The doctor sighed and leaned forward. Please hurry, Mrs. Thandi. Your husband's condition is worsening every day. Without the surgery, well, anything can happen. Those words hit Thandi like a thunderbolt. She stood abruptly, tears spilling over again. Thank you, doctor, she mumbled before rushing out of the office. That night, at exactly 3 a.m., Thandi sat up in bed. The room was silent except for the steady ticking of the old wall clock. Her chest felt heavy, and tears streamed down her face as she clutched her pillow. She sobbed into it, her heart breaking with every thought. I can't let anything happen to Sipho, she whispered into the darkness. Memories of their life together flooded her mind. She thought about the day they met and how kind he had been from the very beginning. Sipho had always been patient, loving, and supportive. Even during tough times, he was her rock. She remembered the night he stayed up caring for her when she was sick and the way he always made her laugh. Her voice trembled as she spoke to herself. If it were me in that hospital bed, Sipho would do anything to save me. I know he would. Wiping her tears, she resolved, he's shown me nothing but love all these years. I have to save him, no matter what. With a sudden burst of determination, Thandi grabbed her phone from the bedside table. She dialed Nomsad's number. It rang twice before Nomsad's groggy voice answered. Thandi? What's wrong? Thandi took a deep breath, her voice steady but full of pain. Nomsa, I've made up my mind. I'll do it. I'll do whatever it takes to save Sipho. The next morning, Thandi stood at the entrance of Mr. Dlamini's mansion. The towering gates loomed over her, a physical representation of the emotional weight she carried. She clutched her handbag tightly, her palms sweating as fear and guilt gnawed at her insides. A security guard opened the gate and let her in, his face unreadable. As she walked through the well-manicured garden towards the massive house, Thandi's mind replayed all the moments she shared with Sipho and Ayanda. This is for them, she whispered, trying to convince herself. Mr. Dlamini greeted her in his expansive living room. His smug smile and the way his eyes roved over her made her skin crawl. I knew you'd come around, he said, pouring himself a glass of wine. You're a brave woman, Thandi, doing whatever it takes for love. Thandi said nothing, her hands trembling. She could barely focus as he led her upstairs. Every step felt like a betrayal, but the thought of losing Sipho kept her moving forward. When it was over, Thandi left the mansion feeling hollow. She avoided Mr. Dlamini's knowing gaze as he handed her a check. Once outside, she leaned against a wall and cried silently, her tears soaking the check that represented both hope and heartbreak. She returned to the hospital and handed the money to the doctor. The surgery was scheduled immediately. As Sipho was wheeled into the operating room, Thandi held his hand, whispering, I love you, my darling. Please come back to us. Hours felt like days as she waited outside the operating room. Nomsa sat beside her, offering silent support. Finally, the surgeon emerged, his expression calm. The surgery was a success. Sipho will need time to recover, but he's going to be okay. Relief washed over Thandi like a tidal wave. She collapsed into Nomsa's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. He's alive, she whispered. He's alive. Sipho's recovery was slow but steady. As he grew stronger, Thandi found herself consumed with guilt. The weight of her secret was unbearable. She avoided eye contact with him and often stayed quiet when they spoke. One evening, as they sat together in their small living room, Sipho reached for her hand. Thandi, he said softly, you've been distant. What's wrong? Thandi's heart raced. Her mind screamed at her to keep quiet, but she couldn't live with the burden anymore. Tears welled up in her eyes as she turned to him. Sipho, there's something I need to tell you, she began, her voice shaking. She recounted everything, her desperation, Mr. Dlamini's demand, and her ultimate decision to go through with it. Sipho's face was a mixture of shock and pain. He pulled his hand away and stared at her in silence. Thandi felt her world crumbling around her. I did it for you, Sipho. To save your life, she pleaded. I didn't want to lose you. The days that followed were tense. Sipho withdrew into himself, struggling to process what he had learned. Meanwhile, Thandi began noticing strange behavior in herself. She would sometimes forget simple things, like where she left her keys or what she was about to say. Then the nightmares began. In her dreams, she would hear voices whispering, mocking her, reminding her of her infidelity. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding. One morning, as she prepared breakfast, she suddenly dropped the plate she was holding and screamed. The room spun around her, and the voices in her head grew louder. Namsa rushed over, finding Thandi on the floor, clutching her head and crying out, "Make it stop. Please make it stop." The curse had begun. News of Thandi's condition spread quickly through the village. The elders convened to discuss the matter. They confirmed that the gods of Nuku had been angered by Thandi's actions, and only Sipho's forgiveness and the sacred cleansing ritual could save her. But Sipho was torn. His love for Thandi clashed with his feelings of betrayal. "How can I forgive her after what she did?" he asked Namsa one evening. "Namsa, ever the voice of reason, said, Sipho, she made a sacrifice for you. She risked everything to save your life. If you truly love her, you'll find it in your heart to forgive her and save her." As Sipho watched Thandi deteriorate, his resolve softened. One evening, he went to her bedside. She was a shadow of the woman he knew, her once bright eyes now dull and filled with fear. "Thandi," he said, his voice breaking, "I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why you did what you did, but I know that I can't lose you. You're my wife, the mother of our daughter. I'll do the ritual." Tears streamed down Thandi's face as she whispered, "Thank you, Sipho. I'm so sorry for everything." The next morning, the village elders prepared for the sacred cleansing ritual. It was a solemn affair, with villagers gathering to witness the ceremony. Sipho stood before the elders, declaring his forgiveness and pleading with the gods to lift the curse. As the final chants were sung, Thandi collapsed to the ground. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, she opened her eyes, clarity returning to them for the first time in weeks. The curse was lifted. Thandi and Sipho returned home, vowing to rebuild their lives together. Though the scars of their ordeal remained, their love endured. They learned that true love is not without its trials, but it is in forgiveness and sacrifice that its strength is truly tested. This story reminds us of the complexities of love, sacrifice, and redemption. What would you do for the people you love? Let us know in the comments below. Early the next morning, Thandi arrived at Mr. Dlamini's sprawling estate. The ornate iron gates creaked open, and a security guard gestured her inside. The mansion loomed before her, its grandeur contrasting sharply with the anguish she felt inside. She took a deep breath and steadied herself. "For Sipho," she whispered, clutching her handbag tightly. As she stepped through the doors, Mr. Dlamini greeted her with a self-assured smile, his eyes cold and calculating. "I knew you'd come around," he said, pouring himself a glass of wine. His words made Thandi's skin crawl, but she stayed silent, her heart heavy with the weight of her decision. When it was over, Thandi walked out of the mansion feeling like a hollow shell. She held the check in her trembling hand, tears streaming down her face. Shame, anger, and sadness churned inside her. At the hospital, she handed the check to the doctor. "Schedule the surgery immediately," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Within days, the surgery was underway. Thandi sat in the waiting room, clutching Ayanda tightly. Namsa stayed by her side, her presence a silent comfort. Hours passed like lifetimes, but finally, the surgeon emerged. "The surgery was successful," he announced. "Sipho is stable, but he'll need time to recover fully." Thandi's knees buckled, and she collapsed into Namsa's arms, tears of relief spilling over. "He's alive," she whispered. "Thank God he's alive." Sipho's recovery was slow but steady. Thandi devoted herself to his care, her guilt growing with each passing day. She avoided his gaze and barely spoke to him, afraid her secret would spill out. One evening, As Sipho lay resting in their bedroom, he called out to her, "Thandi, come sit with me." She hesitated before sitting at the edge of the bed. He reached for her hand, his grip weak, but full of love. "You've been so quiet. Is something bothering you?" Thandi froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she couldn't keep the truth from him forever. Tears filled her eyes as she began to speak. "Sipho, there's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice shaking. Over the next few minutes, she poured out everything: her desperation, Mr. Dlamini's demand, and the painful decision she made to save him. Sipho stared at her, his face a mixture of shock and pain. He pulled his hand away, his silence cutting deeper than any words could. I did it for you," Thandi whispered, sobbing. "I couldn't let you die. Please believe me." In the days that followed, Sipho withdrew into himself, struggling to reconcile his love for Thandi with his feelings of betrayal. Meanwhile, Thandi began experiencing strange symptoms. At first, it was small things, forgetting where she left something or zoning out mid-conversation. But soon, the symptoms worsened. She began hearing whispers in her mind, voices mocking her and replaying her actions. One evening, while preparing dinner, she suddenly screamed and dropped the knife she was holding. Namsa rushed in to find her trembling on the floor, clutching her head. "Make it stop. Please make it stop," Thandi cried. Namsa knelt beside her, tears in her eyes. "Thandi, the curse, it's begun." News of Thandi's condition spread quickly through the village. The elders convened to discuss the matter and confirmed what everyone feared: the gods of Nuku had been angered by Thandi's actions. The elders declared that only Sipho's forgiveness and the sacred cleansing ritual could lift the curse. But Sipho was torn. Every time he looked at Thandi, he saw both the woman he loved and the weight of her betrayal. "Why should I forgive her after what she's done?" he asked Namsa one evening, his voice filled with anguish. Namsa placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sipho, she made the ultimate sacrifice for you. She risked everything to save your life. If you love her, you must forgive her. Only then can she be free." As Thandi's condition worsened, Sipho's resolve began to soften. He watched as the woman he loved slowly unraveled before his eyes. One night, he sat by her bedside, holding her hand. "Thandi," he said softly, his voice breaking. "I don't know if I'll ever understand why you did what you did, but I know I can't lose you. You're my wife, the mother of my child. I'll do the ritual." Thandi's eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "Thank you, Sipho. I'm so sorry for everything." The next morning, the entire village gathered for the sacred cleansing ritual. The elders led the ceremony, chanting prayers to appease the gods. Sipho stood before them, declaring his forgiveness and pleading for Thandi's sanity to be restored. As the final chant echoed through the air, Thandi collapsed to the ground. The crowd gasped, holding their breath. Moments later, she opened her eyes. For the first time in weeks, her gaze was clear and the torment in her mind was gone. The curse had been lifted. Thandi and Sipho returned home, determined to rebuild their lives. Though the scars of their ordeal remained, their love endured. They learned that forgiveness is not a weakness, but a strength, and true love often requires unimaginable sacrifice. This story teaches us about the complexities of love, sacrifice, and redemption. What would you do for the people you love? Let us know in the comments below.